Hello, everybody. This is Doug Reeves from Boston, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Howie Knoff, and we're going to, Knopf, I should say, and we're going to spend some time together talking about fixing multi-tiered systems of support, the keys to successful multi-tiered academic and behavioral interventions. Before we get underway, however, it's always useful if you will tell me whether or not you have good video and audio. So would you please use either the chat or question function to let me know that you have good audio and video, then we'll get underway with Dr. Knopf. All right, it looks like we have good audio and video and a wonderful crowd. Thank you so much for your participation this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Howie Knoff. He's an international consultant focusing on school improvement, discipline and behavior management, social skills training, and social and emotional learning, and multi-tiered systems of support. Howie's been a university professor, a State Department of Education program director. He's the director of Project Achieve and Creative Leadership Solutions partner. Howie has written 18 books, over 100 articles and book chapters, and he was the 21st president of the National Association of School Psychologists. Howie, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much, Doug. It's good to be here. We want to remind people that you can communicate with us either through the chat box, or if you would like to text directly to us, the number's on the screen. So you've got 781-710-9633, and we will try to address some of your questions, but certainly if we can't address all of them, you can email us and we'd be happy to provide whatever services and supports that we can provide to you. So let's get to the presentation. Toback said that great innovators don't see different things, they see the same things differently. And, you know, we're all focusing in the schools on trying to educate all kids to the greatest degree possible, both from an academic and a social, emotional, and behavioral. But as it relates to multi-tiered services, sometimes we're dealing with some of the most challenging kids. And when we look at multi-tiered services right now, we're kind of in a new world to some degree. With the new Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we can look at the multi-tiered system a little bit differently. And so hopefully today's discussion will encourage you and give you some frameworks within which to do that. What we're going to do today, we're going to talk about basically three things. I'm going to give you an overview of MTSS from hopefully a common sense perspective, but also a science to practice perspective. And then we're also going to talk about where MTSS fits in the new Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and then spend most of our discussion talking about some of the past flaws in the MTSS and RTI systems and some very direct solutions and ways to really think about things in a different way so that you can hopefully bring your MTSS system from good to great or great to greater. Big picture to start. The ultimate educational goal is to maximize all students' academic achievement and their social, emotional, and behavioral development. And, you know, in the past, we've kind of integrated the two together, but it's been more on a catch-as-catch-can basis, and some of the systems now look at both the academic and the behavior. But now with the new Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we really need to look at both sides as it relates to not just the academic achievement, but the climate of the school, looking at the behavior of the school, and many of the different behavioral indicators that schools are now going to have to basically report on an annual basis in terms of discipline, suspensions, expulsions, times that kids are being escorted out of the building relative to law enforcement and so on. But again, from a big picture perspective, from an academic learning and achievement perspective, we really have to look at boiling everything down, the ultimate goal as being to help kids to become independent learners. And obviously, an independent learner looks different from kindergarten to third, fifth to seventh, and 11th. But nonetheless, that's really what our focus is on. From a social, emotional, and behavioral perspective, we're trying to teach kids social, emotional, and behavioral self-management skills so that they're able to independently make their own decisions in that social emotional kind of domain and function in an interpersonal and conflict prevention way to the greatest degree possible. Now, even now, as you can look at this slide, you see these kind of concentric circles. And there's two kind of aspects that I want to emphasize. One is that the academics is interdependent with the social emotional behavioral. I mean, we're talking about not just great classroom instruction, but also great classroom management that's moving kids to the independent learning and the self-management status. But as you look at the three concentrics, that's our representation of the tiers in a multi-tiered system. And I'm going to show you as we move into the discussion that really the perspective is that the tiers and the service delivery are fluid, and really what the tiers are all about are the intensity of services, support, strategies, and programs that kids need to be successful from preschool through high school. So the MTSS process needs to focus on providing students those academic and social, emotional, and behavioral services, support, strategies, and programs that they need to be successful, from a prevention and enrichment to a strategic intervention to an intensive need, or if you will, crisis management perspective or level. Now, all the things that I'm talking about today, these are not just kind of pie in the sky, research, hypothetical kind of things. What I've done over the past 35 plus years in my career is I'm a practitioner. And we started in Florida, in Lakeland, Florida, and we began to work with one of the most difficult schools in that county. And we did it from a strategic organizational perspective, from an academic instruction perspective, from a discipline and behavior management perspective, and that evolved into Project Achieve. And so what we've been doing for the past 35 years is implementing systemic change from the top down and the bottom up. And in fact, Project Achieve is designated an evidence-based model through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So we've worked in thousands of schools in every state in the country, including internationally. And we've basically got this down to a system, down to a model, down to the implementation of practices. This is not a program, but this is an integration science to practice of what works as it relates to multi-tiered services. So this is based on experience in the field, experience that continues to this day. Doug and I are probably on the road somewhere between 175 and 200 days a year working in schools, helping them to implement these systems. And you can see on the slide some of the places that we've done this in. And maybe the most notable at the top and then the bottom is that this was, what I'm talking to you today, through the State Personnel Development Grant, where I was the director of that grant for 13 years. What I'm talking to you today was the multi-tiered services, the systematic school improvement system for the state of Arkansas for 13 years. But we've also implemented it in places like different Native American communities, from the preschool to the high school, juvenile justice, and beyond. So this is a field-tested and user-friendly system. So what are the component parts? Starting with the beginning, the front end, if you will, of the multi-tiered process. It starts in the classroom. It starts with effective instruction and effective classroom management delivered by effective teachers. Now, not every teacher is going to be effective with all kids, and especially given the diversity and the challenges that students come to the schoolhouse door with every day. So there's got to be a consultation, a related services, a wraparound process for those classroom teachers that's integrated into the multi-tiered process. But what teachers are trying to do is they're teaching the kids on an academic and a behavioral perspective, and they're looking at and assessing the student's mastery of academic material and the kids' response, positive response, hopefully, to classroom management. And they're monitoring that in an ongoing way. And then teachers are really the first line of defense, in a sense, when students are not having the success that we want, because teachers are using data to figure out why students are not responding to the classroom management or are not mastering the academic material, and they're doing error analyses, they're doing observations, they're doing comparisons. And so what they're doing with their data is the kids that are not making it and presenting with challenges, they're moving into some kind of a systematic intervention mode of operation. But sometimes it's just not enough. And so the tier one, which is a very complex system, as you can see here, the Tier 1 system is one that's got to be both responsive to kids, but also be able to react as kids are not succeeding. And so in the preventative system of a classroom, we want to emphasize the following things. And this is important because this is the beginning of the multi-tiered system. And sometimes what we've got to do is we've got to look for kids who we call instructional casualties, kids who are curricular casualties, and then the kids who have more of the challenges that are more idiosyncratic to them. And again, if you think about it, when we've got students of mobility especially, sometimes kids are not getting the instruction that they need. Sometimes they've got 3 teachers in the course of 1 year. They may have a long-term substitute. And that's all important to understand as we're trying to understand, is this a student who is not learning, or is this a student who can't learn under the current conditions and needs more strategic or intensive work? And so in an effective classroom, curricular alignment and total instructional alignment in terms of looking at the academic and behavioral outcomes, making sure that kids are in effective instructional groups, making sure that we're actually doing and implementing the differentiated instruction at a level of fidelity. Obviously, the kids are part of the system, so we've got to have ready, prepared, and motivated kids, and all things being equal, we have to teach kids at their instructional levels. We have to teach them in their zones of success, certainly with a fair amount of challenge. But if we're teaching kids at frustration, then literally they're going to get frustrated and they're not going to learn. You can look at this slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but obviously we've got a science of pedagogy. We've got a science of what makes effective teaching successful. And in that science, it's not just the pedagogy, obviously. If you look at some of the Danielson work, it also looks at the classroom management. It looks at how teachers are working together, how related service people are available for the consultation, and whether or not the system is wrapping around and providing the resources and the training and the mentoring that teachers need to be successful. Obviously, things that we need as outcomes is we've got to have students who are engaged. We've got to make sure that we're progress monitoring students, but with progress monitoring assessment tools that are authentic and give us real-time data. We've got to have in that prevention system in the classroom teachers who are capable of doing the remediation, the accommodation, and the modification as needed, and then obviously teachers are doing that early academic intervention as needed for specific students. So if you look at the instructional environment, these are the big chunks, the big domains in the instructional environment. We have teacher instructional factors, we've got curricular factors, and we have student factors, but again, that's past and present. So we may have some students who right now need strategic intervention because the previous instruction wasn't as effective, whether that was situational or based on what was happening in the classroom, but sometimes past instructional factors are what have summed up to the current student needs. Sometimes we have new curricula, we have new standards, obviously, and sometimes the curriculum is not well matched to the students, and so we have curricular casualties. There's students who are not learning, but it's not that they can't learn, they just haven't learned under the curricular conditions that were either present or past. And then obviously we have times where a lot of the issues and challenges are within the student, and so we've got to do those focused interventions relative to those specific students. But where does the multi-tiered process go? Well, when kids, from a classroom perspective, are still not making it, even with all the great things that the classroom teacher is doing, the teachers need to, in essence, phone a friend. They need consultation. They need sometimes to up that multidisciplinary problem-solving process to the next level. And so as students continue to present with academic or behavioral challenges, the multi-tiered system then gets into a more formal process in terms of database problem solving, more diagnostic, more intensive potentially classroom interventions. We're monitoring students more frequently, and then we're determining whether or not we're successful or not. And so as we move in the multi-tiered process, it becomes more specialized, more multidisciplinary, and more strategic or intensive. But the intensity of the services are driven basically by the student outcomes. And so the goals ultimately of an MTSS process is to use that problem-solving process and linking the assessment results to research-based instruction or interventions. Make sure that our teachers have the consultation needed to be able to implement the more specialized instruction or the strategic interventions with fidelity. We're collecting our data because sometimes the interventions are still not working. But another key goal here is through the consultation process to increase or add to the knowledge and skills of the teachers so that where they need consultation for the case right now, they may not need that consultation in the future because they've learned how to generalize the case-specific consultation and interventions now into future cases. And so, reflections, Doug, on this as a first kind of cut on describing the MTSS process.
Yeah, what I really want to reinforce about what Howie just had to say is the idea of focusing on practice. What has happened way too often, not just in these areas, but in many others, is that there is a short-term implementation. People buy a program, they incur a cost, then they get frustrated because it doesn't have immediate impact and quit, and then go out and buy another program. What Howie's talking about here are long-term sustainable implementation patterns. And that's what's really important. It's not a one and done, but a real long-term system of support. Howie, before you begin again, I just want to ask if you could be a little closer to your microphone, so a little bit of the audio is going in and out.
Sure. Is that a little bit better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, not a problem. Sorry. All right. So George Eliot said it's never too late to be what you might have been. And that's just representative of education. We're always in a state of change. We're tinkering, we're making mid-course corrections, and we're always trying to, again, go from great to greater, good to great, and sometimes, unfortunately, some of our schools are just trying to get to the good level. But nonetheless, we have a great opportunity here with the new Elementary and Secondary Education Act to kind of rethink, to relook at, to redesign and implement a different or an upgrade, if you will, a 2.0 to our multi-tiered service system approach. The new Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is now in force as of this past July 1st, it basically, in a big picture perspective, it transferred much of the responsibility for the development and the implementation, as well as the evaluation of our effective school and schooling processes, down to the state departments of education, down to the districts, down to the individual schools. So in essence, it's a local perspective now. It's looking at our kids and what our kids needs and what our system is doing and what our system needs to do to have the greatest effectiveness possible. But you've got to do a close reading of the law. And these are some boundaries that I think are going to open up some flexibility for schools and districts especially. The new Elementary Secondary Education Act does not mention the word response to intervention. And in fact, the Special Education IDEA 2004 never uses that term either. And so a lot of RTI was more designed by the national folk at the departments of education, by the state departments of education, and it certainly went beyond what the letter of the law said, and that's a good thing, but it's not as prescriptive as you might think. In the new Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the word positive behavioral interventions and supports appears 3 times. Multi-tiered systems of support appears 5 times in the entire law. But this is key. It is always in the lower case. There are no capital letters in those terms, and in the law, there are no acronyms. There's no capital PBIS. There's no capital MTSS system. And so the law does not require the districts and the schools to use the U.S. Department of Education's PBIS or MTSS frameworks. It's not in federal law. Now, if it's in state law, that's a different issue. But the deal is that the PBIS capital and the MTSS are different approaches that have been designed by the Department of Education. They are not the only approach. So what districts and schools can do is basically take the flexibility in the law, and as long as they're within the context of the law, create their own system to meet their own needs. Here's the definition of multi-tiered system of support in the federal law, Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And this is it, a comprehensive continuum of evidence-based systemic practices to support a rapid response to students' needs with regular observation to facilitate data-based instructional decision-making. That's the definition. That's a very broad definition. And so again, you can create, you can grow your own. And again, it's only in the law 5 times. 2 of them are in the definition that I just read, and the other 3 especially relate to struggling, which could be a lot of students, English second language, and student with disabilities. And so kind of the bottom line, state departments of education and districts that accept federal funds have to create and develop their own system. They're not required to adopt the U.S. Department of Education system, either on the MTSS side or on the more specialized positive behavioral support side in terms of discipline, behavior management, and student self-management. And the districts and the schools really can't be penalized if they use a defensible system, even if it's a system of their own making. And so schools need to revisit right now. They need to revalidate their multi-tiered services and supports, and especially reevaluate given many of the flaws that have been inherent in the frameworks that have been basically advocated by the Department of Education and its TA centers, and I'm going to talk about as we get into the flaws of this part of the discussion. But again, let's give pause and look at some of the research. And again, I could cite all sorts of different things, but here's probably the most critical study that's come out in the last number of years. This is a study, a national report that was commissioned by the U.S. Department of Education. It came out in 2015, and the title of it is Evaluation of Response to Intervention Practices for Elementary School Reading. It's the largest federal investigation of its kind, 24,000 first through third graders in 13 states, 146 schools, and what they did was they created a comparison group. So they identified 100 randomly selected comparison schools in the same states that were not implementing the RTI system of the U.S. Department of Education. So the study looked at literacy progress of kids first through third grade for a school year, and they primarily looked at, they took the real assessments that the schools were doing. So individually assessed, administered norm reference and state high stakes proficiency test. The students in the 146 RTI school were given, and this is what they were evaluating, Tier 2 interventions. The comparison schools were not doing Tier 2 interventions. The kids were staying in the regular classroom. And again, it's a comparison group of apples and apples. These are kids in the comparisons group, schools that barely missed or didn't receive the Tier 2 services, even though they would have qualified. So we've got 119, 127, 112 RTI schools that the data were collected at the first grade, second, and third grade, respectively. Here are the results. The first graders in the implementation group who were receiving the Tier 2 pullout services performed 11% lower on the reading assessments than the comparison kids who stayed in the regular classroom. At the first grade level, only 4 of 119 schools, 3% of the schools that were doing the Tier 2 pullout basically showed benefits. 15 of the schools basically had negative effects, and 84% of the schools, the kids showed no benefit at all. So the kids flatlined, in essence. The second and third graders receiving the Tier 2 interventions experienced no significant reading benefits from the pull-out Tier 2 interventions, although they didn't lose ground. The students who were already receiving special ed or who were retained and old for grade basically had very poor results in the Tier 2 interventions. And for all of the kids, the reading results that I'm citing to you did not differ by income level, racial groups, or native languages. So in essence, based on all of these kids, 24,000 plus kids, all of these states, the RTI system that we have and have had is not cutting it. It's not producing the results that it should produce. And so once again, here is not necessarily, kind of running down the RTI or the current MTS system of the Department of Education, but saying, look, we can do better. We need to do better because our kids are not succeeding in this system the way it's designed currently. Reflections, Doug.
Sorry, I muted myself, so my wife,
okay.
She had a mute button to push for me also. Yes, actually, we've got some questions from our participants that I wanted to ask you. Several people are asking, will they have access to these slides? And yes, you'll have the video and the audio, all the slides available. They are usually ready about an hour or so after the webinar, and you can download them at nativeleadership.net. We're happy to send those to you. This is a more extensive question, however. It says, do you not feel that this supports the focus on student empowerment of how they learn and how they know if they learned, assessments toward not only assisting the teacher, but the student in recognizing what is understood or not yet related to student outcomes? This then assists with meeting the components of an effective classroom. Please share your thoughts about empowerment of learning and assessments to support MTSS.
Yeah, I totally agree with the comment. I mean, the kids, as you saw in the instructional environment design, they're part of the system. And so let me get at this in maybe two different ways. I mean, one is that, yes, we need to listen to the kids. That's been a missing part of the equation for a long period of time. Some of our students are as frustrated as some of our educators, and they want to do better also. And sometimes, again, the emotional overlay is undermining the process. Sometimes kids' attributions, their belief in their potential for success, is undermining their success. And so we've got to listen to the kids. We've got to systematically evaluate what they think is working, what's not working, and so on. And that's especially true as we get into the upper grade levels, the middle school and the high school. But another kind of more subtle thing is, are we really integrating at the highest level possible the metacognitive aspects of our pedagogy? In other words, are we just spoon-feeding kids? I know we're not, but again, we've got to do a kind of a reality check on this, especially with the challenging kids, because sometimes the kids are not learning how to learn because they're not learning, and we're focused so much on just the surface level learning. So we keep hammering on the remediation, and we're not always getting to the metacognitive kind of aspects that can help kids to understand. If you really look at the differentiated instruction, research to practice, one of the things that they talk about is designing your pedagogical systems to understand how the kids learn best and how the kids express their learning best. And in order to do that, we've got to talk to the kids. So I think a point well taken. So moving on, Rosalind Carter said, a great leader takes people where they don't necessarily want to go, but where they ought to be. And so again, change is difficult. We all understand that. But there are certain non-negotiables in this process. And as it relates to students' outcomes, academically and behaviorally, we can't have opt-outs in the system. We've got to do what is appropriate, what's right, and we've got to call people when they're potentially opting out of the process. So let's talk about some of the flaws in the solutions, and I'm going to try to do this in a user-friendly kind of way and in a, kind of here are the solutions way, which I think is really the most important focus. But let me talk about, in essence, broadly 8 flaws. We'll do 4, and then we'll see about discussion, and then we'll do the latter 4. So flaw 1, which is, again, this is not implicating every school district, every state in the country. It's not, because, a lot of the systems are designed this way. But again, we sometimes forget. Missing sometimes in the multi-tiered system is the knowledge and the understanding, but the functional understanding of the interdependency between the academics and the behavior. And I've read, I've done a fair amount of research. I've read any number of state MTSS manuals, and some of them are not giving equal weight to the academics and the behavior. Yeah, they show you in the slide, but the focus in a lot of these places is so much on literacy. It even sometimes ignores math, it ignores writing and oral language. But even though, again, the behavior is in the slide and it's in the manual, it doesn't drill it down unless the students are presenting with significant social, emotional, and behavioral issues. And so we've got to recognize this interdependency. And here's a way to kind of think about it. Okay, just two very simple questions that I ask classroom teachers all the time. Do you have students who are behaviorally acting out because of academic frustration? And they always say, yes, of course. Do you have students who are academically not making it as quickly as we would like because they have social, emotional, and behavioral things that are undermining? For example, they can't sit in the chair. They can't work independently. They don't have the social and interpersonal skills to work in cooperative learning groups. And of course, teachers say yes. And the point is, at a very functional level, there's an interdependency. And so what happens sometimes is we prematurely disaggregate. And so we look at what we think is a discipline problem, but what we're encouraging in the MTSS process is that what we've got to ask is this student behaviorally acting out because of academic frustration? And the ultimate point is, if the answer is yes, you're not going to be able to solve that problem with a discipline intervention or action. That's going to be an academic issue. That's going to be an alignment issue, but it's also perhaps going to be a student frustration issue. But the issue is, in our thinking, in our analyses from a problem-solving perspective, right from the very beginning, we've got to look at that interdependency between the academic and the behavior. Flaw 2, missing a continuum of instruction. A lot of, again, the state RTI or the multi-tiered services and the guidebooks and the systems that I've reviewed, and going into the schools. I mean, I was in Mississippi the early part of the week. Last week I was in Ohio. The week before I was in Kentucky. The week before I was in the Panhandle of Florida. And again, when it gets down to the functionality, we don't have the academic, if you will, continuum. And so let me put one on the table. Okay. This is one that we actually designed within the Arkansas Department of Education. And so you can see in the umbrella, you've got effective instruction, universal design and differentiation, and continuous progress monitoring. Assistive supports are there just under the umbrella because some kids, all they need is the assistive support, and they're able to learn just like any other learner. But then, do our teachers, do our schools, are they able to differentiate? And there's overlaps, but differentiate the difference between remediation, accommodation, modification, strategic intervention, and compensation, but especially the first three in the general education classrooms. And then, are we assessing the students to figure out which remediations they need, which specific accommodations they need, how to do the modification? And so the decisions on the things that you can see, for example, here in the corkscrew, these are based on data. They're not universal interventions. We don't give preferential seating to all kids. We give preferential seating to the kids that the data tell us need the preferential seating in order to be able to learn more effectively. So again, this is a model that we have designed, developed for the past 25 years, and it's part of the professional development and the consultation relative to teachers, relative to related service, relative to administrators. Flaw 3, a lot of the state RTI or multi-tiered systems have adopted a PBIS framework, and that framework is really not scientifically grounded in psychology. The psychology of learning, cognition of students. It's basically come out of special education, and that's not a bad thing, but it's just to say that the glass is half empty. And what happens, unfortunately, around the country is that people are afraid to basically say that the emperor has no clothes, because the PBIS system has been so pushed and advocated for, and the funding underlying it has kind of followed the advocacy, that people, when it's not working, are saying, geez, you know, I don't know if we can say this. But a national study, just so you know, about 2.5 years ago, came out and evaluated PBIS, and it basically identified the flaws. It identified the fact that even though it's in so many buildings, the national TA directors don't know what different buildings are doing because people are picking off of the framework menu. A lot of PBIS is implemented more in the common areas of the school than the classroom. A lot of the PBIS is basically, you know, focusing on the tier 1, and it never gets to the tier 2 and the tier 3. And so just from a common sense perspective, if you've got kids with significant behavioral challenges in the classroom, you can't wait for the PBIS system to catch up. You've got to address those right now at the same time, so you've got to do a top-down, bottom-up. But what's missing is the science. And again, very quickly, here are the scientific components of student self-management. You've got to have positive relationships across the school, in the classroom, and positive climates. You've got to have behavioral expectations and skill instruction, but the expectations have to be explicit. Listening, following directions, asking for help, ignoring distractions, responding to teasing. Being safe, respectful, and responsible, those are clusters of behavior. You can't teach a student responsibility. You have to teach them the behaviors of responsibility. There have to be motivational and accountability systems in the classroom. We've got to have consistency across the board, because if we have inconsistency, it undercuts accountability and students' behavior is differential. And then we've got to address the special situations. We've got to go from the classroom out to the common areas of the school. We've got to go from the individual student and address the peer group, especially as it relates to teasing, taunting, bullying, harassment, hazing, and fighting. We've got to deal with the idiosyncratic special situations of kids who are coming from poverty, kids who are coming from different backgrounds, kids who are coming from areas of dysfunction, kids who are coming to school with trauma. You don't need a trauma program. You need the science that treats trauma. You don't need a bullying program. You need the science that prevents bullying. And that's what's missing here. And again, as Doug said earlier, you don't need a program. You need science to practice. Science to practice based on what we know works in terms of pedagogy, in terms of human behavior, in terms of student learning. Flaw 4, the tiers. The tiers reflect the intensity of services, support strategies, and programs. It's a prevention, strategic intervention, and intensive need crisis management continuum. The tiers are not about percentages. And parenthetically, somebody asked one of the PBIS national directors many years ago, in fact, it was a state director of special ed, where did the percentages come from? And the response was, we made them up. It's not about percentages, folks. It's not about the place of service delivery. It's not the people who are doing the service delivery. It's about the intensity of services that kids need and the ability and the resourcing of our schools and districts to deliver those services and supports. And so again, the multi-tiered process is as you see on this diagram. And we have on and off ramps, which I'll talk about later. But we've got to figure out in the multi-tiered system, do we have an academic issue? Do we have a behavioral issue? Do we have a combined issue? We've got to look at the intensity of the need and why the need exists. We've got to do the functional assessments to determine the underlying reasons why kids are having difficulty. And then we've got to match and connect and link the services at the right intensity to address the real problems. Flaw 5. And again, I'm going to talk about it more from a solution perspective. Everyone in the building needs to be trained in the database problem-solving process. There needs to be a protocol. We've got to do our assessments in a far more effective way. So if we're going to do screening, we don't throw kids into intervention groups based on the screening. We have to identify the false positives and the false negatives, but we've got to do diagnostic assessment so that the Tier 2 intervention is really strategic. It's not a universal Tier 2 intervention where all of the kids that red flag, for example, on Dibbles or AimsWeb are getting the same interventions. The teachers have to be doing the database problem solving at a higher degree of sophistication at Tier 1, and we shouldn't be moving kids up and down the tiers in a sequential fashion. If a student needs Tier 3 services right now, they get Tier 3 services. They don't have to be failing in Tier 1 and then go through 6 or 8 weeks or whatever it is in Tier 2, fail in Tier 2 to, quote, qualify for Tier 3. If kids need the tiered services, they get them right away. And so the database problem-solving process we've got to do with a higher level of integrity. We've got to recognize that we have the tiers and we have to deliver the tiered services, the intensity of services based on the student need. So let's stop right here with the first 5 kind of flaws. We'll get to the last 3, but let's pause and see, Doug, if you've got some reflections or some questions.
I do, and one of them is right on point to what you just said about the gap between what people intend to do. I think you said a menu-based approach rather than actually deep implementation. So here's the question, to quote our participant. With regard to the RTI research, was the fidelity of implementation and interventions monitored and evaluated? In other words, is the problem RTI or the level of implementation of RTI? And I think you could say the same thing about PBIS. If it's only done in common areas, it may be 3 hours late to be a very effective intervention.
Well, kind of flexing the problem-solving process. It's not either or. It's basically it's an empirical question. All right. So if we're doing some kind of an intervention, whether that's an academic or behavioral intervention, and it's not working, we've got to fall back in the problem-solving process, and we've got to ask some questions, because the intervention could not be working because we identified the wrong problem, or we had a student with multiple problems and we prioritized the target problems in a way that wasn't the most effective, let's say. We've got to decide, did we do an analysis that truly uncovered the root causes of the problem? And it may be that the analysis was faulty and not the intervention. We've got to look at the intervention certainly in terms of the fidelity of the intervention, but we've also, sometimes what happens is you've got the root cause of the problem and you've got multiple different intervention or instructional options. And at some point, you've got to make a clinical decision as to where do you go. And it could be that we made the wrong decision in terms of using this intervention instead of that intervention. So the short answer to the question is we've got to fall back and we've got to be guided by the data. We've got to be guided by the problem and analysis. We can't assume that it's because of fidelity. We have to prove that it was because the implementation wasn't with integrity. And if that's the case, then we have to up it and basically do a better job of the implementation. But again, as I said, we may have identified the wrong problem, or we may have identified the wrong solutions.
Our questioner and Howie have both made this critically important point. Well, we at Creative Leadership use what we call impact insight, which addresses precisely those two questions that Howie just identified, which is A, is the intervention being implemented, and B, even if it is it the right intervention, and what's the impact on student achievement? And I can't tell you the number of times where people are acting in good faith, but the answer to both of those questions may be no. And the earlier a superintendent knows that, the better. Speaking of superintendents, we have one more question, Howie, and then we'll go back to conclude our time together. And this is a really difficult one. It says, from a superintendent's point of view, what has got to be top down and what's got to be bottom up?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And honestly, on a systemic level, and Doug and I do this all the time with the Inside Impact, I mean, one of the things that we're doing is, as we're building or helping a school or a district to build or rebuild its MTS system, we're doing strategic assessments. We're doing needs assessment. We're doing resource analyses. We're doing gap analyses. And quite honestly, and it's not to kind of finesse the question, but there are some districts that we work in because of the strategic analyses that there are certain things that are top down, but in other systems, the same things are bottom up. And so it really becomes, again, a key here. What Elementary and Secondary Education Act is allowing us to do is to not prescribe even the implementation process, but to utilize the resources and utilize the people and implement in the most wise ways, in the most strategic ways. And so, there are many roads to Rome, and sometimes you're going to have to take different routes. And sometimes it may look circuitous, but it's really the most direct route. Again, the problem-solving process becomes critical in this process. And, kind of piggybacking on Doug's comments before we move into the tail end of this presentation, one of the things that we don't want to do as you think about the four-step database problem-solving process, we don't want to play what I call intervention roulette. We don't want to just start throwing interventions at these kids, because we believe every time you do an intervention that doesn't work, you potentially make the student more resistant to the next intervention. And so intervention is not a benign act, it's a strategic act. Looking again at the question from the superintendent, on a broader level, same kind of parallel. Every time you do a systemic intervention, that doesn't work, you potentially make the staff more resistant to the next systemic intervention. And so that's why it's got to be done strategically. We've got to sometimes apply some of the business principles and the management principles and strategic planning principles to doing good work. I rarely go into schools or districts where people are going out of their way to be ineffective. People are doing the best they can under the conditions and resources they have, but they're also, they do what they know. And sometimes they don't know what they don't know, and that's why that outside consultation sometimes is very important. Flaw 6, relative to case referrals and your building level MTSS team. And some people are going to be kind of set back on their chairs with this, but again, I want you to think about how you work or how professionals work in a hospital. I mean, basically, there are things that you do that you've got to do, otherwise you lose patients. And you prioritize and sometimes reprioritize the time, the effort, the resources, the people that have to be at the table in order to get the job done. All right, so points. Students are not referred to the MTS team. Instructional environments are referred. So in other words, you're not referring a student, you're referring the instructional context of the student. So you've got to look at that teacher instructional process, those curricula, past and present, as well as the student. If all the assessment is done in the student, I can guarantee you'll find a problem. But going back to your grad school, folks, that's a type 1 problem. That's a problem that's an artifact of the assessment and not a reality in terms of the student. The MTSS team has to be staffed by the best academic and behavioral assessment and intervention people in or available to the building. And that team is constituted as a team. It's not on a case-by-case basis. There is a set team, and it includes your best academic and behavioral people so that you can look at that interdependency right from the very beginning, as well as your assessment and intervention people. The meetings are weekly and during the school day. If you were in intensive care and your medical team was getting together before hospital hours or after hospital hours, where some people couldn't make the meeting, how would you feel? So this is not a catch as catch can. These are the kids that have the most critical needs. We need to knock these out of the park right at the very beginning. There's no intervention rule or criterion for teachers to be able to have a case discussed at the building level team. In the tradition, still in some of our districts, folks, the teachers have to do X number of interventions for X period of time and show the data that demonstrates that the interventions didn't work. And what's happening in our schools, if you really talk to the teachers, is that what the teachers are doing, they've done everything they know to do. It doesn't pass muster so they can get their ticket punched up to the building level team. And so they're pulling down interventions from the internet that have no hope of success just to meet the criterion. That's ludicrous. That's ludicrous, especially if when they're doing interventions that we know are not going to work just to get the ticket punched, we end up compounding the problem or making the problem more resistant to change. The goal of the meeting is to identify the best consultant who's then going to work the case outside of the meeting. We still have meetings, and some of them are marathons, and one of them I was in a state that I'm not going to define, where the district had said, all right, well, you have one MTSS meeting a month, 15 minutes per case, and you stay there until you're done. And what they were trying to do is solve the problem. So they were playing intervention roulette rather than identifying who the best consultant is so that the problem can be solved out in the settings where the problem exists. So again, we've got to look at the instructional environment. The instructional environment is referred for problem solving relative to the multidisciplinary or the multi-tiered service team. Who's on the team? We've got to have the best academic and behavioral assessment and intervention folks in or available to the building. And you set the building meetings at the end of the year for the rest of the year. So the beginning of the school year starts in April. So you set your building MTSS meeting once a week, put it in the master calendar. And even if people have to Skype into the meeting, which is not the most desirable, but if that's what you got to do, that's what you got to do. And again, the goal of the meeting is to identify, do we have enough information on the case so that we can identify the best consultant who will then go into the setting with the classroom teachers to do the deep analysis of the problem and then link it to instructional or intervention approaches. The critical point again is most of the database functional assessment occurs outside of the meeting. Why would we think that sitting around a table where many of us have never even seen the kid, it's a student on a piece of paper or off of a data bank, why would we think that we're going to be able to determine the root causes of a problem in a meeting around a table when that's one of the most complex problems in the school? And that's because there are flaws in the system. The system didn't work. We've got to change the system. Case preparation and a grade level MTSS team. Let me add another dimension. We believe that the buildings, and it gets a little messier at the high school level, a little bit easier as you go to the middle school and the elementary, but we believe that one meeting a month of the grade level team should be talking about student-specific cases. And so the grade level team is acting as a grade level MTSS team. And the issue is this: if you're not doing that at the grade level, then all your cases are going to go up to the building level. And some of the cases are not going to be all that complex, but that's the only place that the case can go in terms of discussion. We have the building level MTSS team identify a consultant. Somebody from the building level MTSS team is assigned as a consultant to every grade level, or there are multiple people assigned as a grade level. So as a teacher in a grade level are thinking about cases, they have a building level consultant to guide the process, to reality check the process, but also to facilitate the process. But then what we're asking the teachers, and we're training the teachers and the related service people to do, is to prepare for the meetings so that when they present the case at the meetings, that all of the information that at least we have in hand is presenting the first time. We don't sit at the building level meeting and go through the records at the meeting, go through the CUME, take the chance of missing critical information because we didn't pull it off of the computer database. And so what we do is we identify and train for what we call the first things first. And so people can read this, but basically the teachers supported by their building level multi-tiered service representative and others like the school nurse and so on, they're collecting the information before they're presenting the case. And the interesting thing in collecting the information, doing the record review, the current functional status of the student, discounting or weighing in the medical, interviewing previous teachers that have worked with the kid or previous interveners. By collecting that information, sometimes what happens is the teacher actually solves his or her own problem, but they're looking at the child in a more comprehensive way, looking at assets and weaknesses, identifying critical life events that have occurred at home, out of the school, discounting or weighing in the medical, physiological, genetic, biochemical right from the very beginning, identifying the student's speed of acquisition, and certainly identifying the number of moves, their attendance, whether or not they had 3 teachers last year, if they've been in 5 buildings in 3 years with 4 different literacy curricula. And so we're collecting all that information to facilitate an identification, again, of the significance, the severity, the intensity of the problem, but also the root cause of the problem. So once all that information is collected, the teacher has 3 options. They actually may have uncovered information that solves a problem. They go back to the classroom and implement. Or they bring it to the grade level team for collegial consultation, or they may go right to the building level team because it needs a multidisciplinary kind of perspective in terms of understanding who the best consultant is and what the root causes are. Last flaw. The focus of interventions is always on skills. It's not on labels. And so, if you're learning disabled, we need to know specifically where the student's disability is impacting their academic progress. The federal government, we have 13 different disability categories. And so why are we evaluating schools and districts based on a conglomerate group where different districts and different schools have a different assortment of kids with different disabilities, and different kids with different disabilities have different intensity of needs? We've got to do interventions implemented by specialists and not paraprofessionals, and with all due respect. But it was interesting in the RTI study that I cited at the beginning of our discussion, 30% of the Tier 2 interventions are being implemented in that study across all of those states and the 24,000 kids. 32% of the interventions were being implemented by paraprofessionals. Well, if you want to talk about implementation fidelity, that would be a pretty suspect area right there. When the academic gap is too big, this is another one of the flaws. There are certain kids where their academic skill set or their behavioral skill set is so far below their current assignment in terms of grade level or their current chronological age that a core instruction plus 30 minutes of remediation is not going to work. So if you get a fifth grader functioning at the third grade level, they're not going to get everything that they need to out of the core instruction, and they're not going to get in 30 minutes of remediation enough remediation to push them up from the third grade level of functionality. And so there's a point where that flaw is going to be rethought. Certain kids need to be taught at their instructional level, especially if they're only making 8 months of progress for 10 months in school. It's not an issue of disability, it's an issue of speed of acquisition. And so we've got to have a more flexible model. We've got to have more tier 2 behavioral interventions. And then, as a parenthetical, who said, and where's the research that says that students need to master basic reading or basic math by grade 3? I don't know any research that says that. That's been driven more by the curriculum than it has been by the science. And so I think we've got to give our kids a break, and maybe we start evaluating and worrying about kids if they haven't mastered the foundational skills in literacy and math and writing by fourth grade, as an example, rather than third grade, because again, some kids have a different speed of acquisition. There are more behavioral interventions than check in and check out and check and connect. And that's a big intervention gap at the tier 2 level. And that's why we have some of the problems that we have. We're waiting for the kids to fail. We're doing a lot of the functional assessment only at the tier 3 level. And then we still have an intervention gap where we don't have staff who are trained in some of the interventions that, quite honestly, have been around for 20 or 25 years. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. We've just got to take the wheel out of mothballs. So that's the last flaw. We've tried to integrate this into something where you can kind of do a read-through of your own. So we want to provide to you 2 resources that we want to offer to you free. Doug and I and Christopher Balo from Illuminate Education, we've summarized some of the things that I've talked about in this last hour in a document called the Multi-Tiered Service and Support Implementation Blueprint. We want to give you the blueprint, and in fact, we're going to go one up on it. We will give any school district, any school in this country, 30 minutes of free telephone consultation if they've, done their due diligence just to talk about how can we move our system, how can we move our MTSS process to the next level of excellence. I'm also very happy to give you the study guide to my best-selling School Discipline, Classroom Management, and Student Self-Management book, which basically gives you a science-to-practice foundation and a different way to look at things than the PBISS framework that has got some of the flaws that we talked about today. And so just email me, and we will get those out to you in the most expedient way possible. Doug?
Well, Howie, thank you so much. We've had some really great ideas, and we are unfortunately almost exactly out of time. But I want to repeat what you said, that we're willing to continue this conversation and have people continue to engage with you and with me and our other colleagues at Creative Leadership Solutions. And several people wanted to know how they can get the recording webinar. We'll be happy to make that available also for free to you. That should be up there literally within a matter of hours. And we'll send everybody who registered a note for the link on that, so you won't have to go hunting for it. Howie, I want to thank you for all your work, and I want to thank our hundreds of participants. This is truly an important piece of work and hit a nerve with a lot of people. Look forward to working with you again. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Have a great weekend.